let's dive in. Again, we want to hear from you, especially because we know that there are going to be a lot of pundits and experts who are going to be kind of wondering what Latinos are thinking in 2020. We figured we'd just ask a year early and let you speak for yourselves. One study from UCLA found that the number of Latinos who voted in the 2014 midterms doubled by the 2018 midterms. So there's a lot more engagement going on. But voting isn't the only way to be engaged, and we'll talk more about voting in just a minute. One way to be engaged is to run for office yourself. And last week, we spoke to Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia. She's a Democrat, one of Houston's newest representatives, about her experiences voting here in Texas. She had a lot of stories to share, including this one about when she tried to vote in 2015. Listen.
I mean, I remember even as a state senator in my own neighborhood, going to vote for the runoff election for Mayor Turner. And when I arrived, they checked the book, and they told me that I wasn't a registered voter, that I couldn't vote. And I was just, of course, astounded and just said, well, no, wait a minute. You know, and I remember telling them, you know, I usually run around, you know, throwing my weight around, but you do realize I'm a state senator in this area, because I didn't recognize the first young woman who talked to me. She said, well, no, ma'am, I need to see your ID. So I showed her my ID, and then I showed her my Senate ID. She said, well, ma'am, your name's not on here. So she kept looking, and then she told me, she said, sorry, you can't vote. You know, but for me knowing the rules and knowing what I could do, because I asked for a provisional vote application then, you know, I would just give up. I would just say, oh, okay, well, you know, and left. So no telling how often that happens, and no telling, you know, whether that person ever comes back to vote.
That's Democratic Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia from Houston. Now, there are a lot of other ways to engage. I mean, what if you can't vote? What if you're not old enough? What if you are not yet a citizen? There are other ways to improve your community, and tonight we're here to talk not just about voting and activism, but all of the different ways that you engage with your community. So, we want to know things like, are you planning to vote in 2019 or 2020? If you are, why? If not, why not? What are some of the big issues that you want to vote on? Are you politically engaged? Are you civically active? What engages you? What turns you off from being engaged in politics at any level? What are some of the things in your neighborhood where you live that you think need to change, that you wish more politicians or the media paid more attention to? What are we getting right? What are we getting wrong? What's the one thing you wish the country knew about you and your issues and what matters to you that never seems to get discussed? Those are the kinds of things we want to hear about tonight. And we have a great panel this evening to help us discuss it. Thank you, Amanda. Amanda, thank you very much. So we have a great panel this evening to help us discuss it. And I will introduce them now. Joining us right to my right is Lina Hidalgo, Harris County Judge. She is newly elected as the Harris County Judge, the top county official in Harris County. Judge Hidalgo, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
Also with us is immigration attorney Jacob Monty. He's a member of the Political Action Committee Hispanic Republicans of Texas and is a former advisor to the Trump campaign. Jacob, welcome. Next to him is Angelica Razo, the Houston area coordinator for Familia, Vota, a nonpartisan organization that's focused on encouraging civic engagement. Angie, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And Jerónimo Cortina is an associate professor of political science and the associate director at the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Houston. Professor Cortina, glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Remember to use your comment cards. If you've got something you want to share, just raise your hand. We'll collect it. Check the box if you'd like to read it on mic, and then we'll get you into the conversation as quickly as possible. I want to start with a question for everyone on the panel about the way that Latino voters are viewed today. What is the one thing that you find people think they know about Latino voters in general, but they really don't? What's the one thing that tends to be misconstrued, that there's a misconception, or that's just flat out false? Judge Hidalgo?
I can take that one. So I think for Latino voters in general, but even perhaps young voters and others that don't vote to that same rate as other folks, there's this assumption, I think, that these communities are just apathetic, that's why they don't participate. And I've seen, and I think a lot of us saw, especially after the 2018 elections, that a lot of those communities and our Latino community has not chosen to be apathetic. They just haven't been welcomed in. There hasn't been an opportunity for them to see the direct relationship between their vote and policy, for them to have access to the vote and to participation. And now that we're beginning to see that and that those openings are beginning to appear, folks are excited to participate. As an example, we had this record turnout. We did, after the election, an open transition process. We wanted to see if the community would stay involved. After voting in record numbers, would they then come out and participate in their government? And so we launched a 7-week-long program all across Harris County, where we held these town halls asking people, okay, we're designing our policies for the next 4 years, largest county in Texas, what do you want to see? We didn't know. Sometimes we plan a party and nobody comes. We didn't know what would happen. We had anywhere from 200 to 600 people show up, speaking all languages, a huge turnout of our Latino community. And that just showed to me, if we make those opportunities available, people will be there. And it's not apathy, it's just a lack of engagement in the part of government.
Jacob, Monty, what about you? What's the one thing that you find people think they know about Latino voters, but they really don't?
Well, I'll speak to the Republicans out there that believe that Latinos should not care about immigration because they're legal. Why should they care about immigration? The problem I see is that if you're a Latino, even though you're able to work and live in the U.S., when you hear rhetoric against immigrants, you think, hey, they could be talking about me, or they could be talking about my family member who might be undocumented. So I think many Republicans, when they start bashing immigrants or talking bad about immigrants, they don't realize that it impacts legal Latinos who are turned off by that rhetoric and who might otherwise consider voting Republican, but when they hear that coming from Republicans, they either don't vote or they vote Democrat.
Angie?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a narrative out there that we all vote the same and for the same reasons. I think that's dangerous because it takes away the stories of why people are voting, why they're getting engaged, why they want to see new leadership in elected positions. And I think we're a diverse community amongst the Latino community, and I don't want this narrative to be continued that we're an easy catch, that we can be easily misinformed, or you just have to construe a story that's going to seem pretty to us, and that's what's going to get our vote out there. But that's not true. I think when you're following that rhetoric, then it means that candidates, elected officials, don't really want to take the time to get to know our community and understand why we want to be present and why we want our voices heard.
Professor?
Well, I think one of the misconceptions about the Latino vote is that it's a homogeneous bloc, that Latino is something that that votes en masse for a particular candidate. And that is wrong, because the Latino vote is more than that. The Latino vote, when you talk about the Latino vote, you have to think about that there's going to be at least 4 types of electorate, right? You're going to have people that are registered but do not vote, people that are registered and vote, and people that could be registered and are not registered, and obviously people that cannot be registered because of age or any other status issue. So when you're talking about these, what Judge Hidalgo was mentioning is very important, how political parties, at the beginning, not government officials, but how political parties engage Latino voters is going to be very, very important. Because perhaps part of this electorate, and when we talk about demographics, we're going to see that there's going to be a very important change, perhaps have not been politically socialized into the American political system that by definition is very, very different from what quote-unquote Latino voters may be used to.
Judge Hidalgo, let me talk to you for a second, particularly about becoming the county judge. What inspired you to run for county judge?
So I'm one of the hundreds of women across the country that had never thought I would run for office, and I was shocked at the divisiveness. It was mentioned earlier, the divisiveness we were seeing. I was taken aback by some of the attacks on our communities, on the press in particular, and I decided, I know what issues my community is facing. I'd worked with families of folks who had died in our county jail. I had worked throughout our public hospital system and seen what a lack of healthcare access in Texas can do. And I'd lived here, seen what was by then 2 500-year floods in 2 years. This was before Harvey. So I figured, someone needs to step up. We're getting to record divisiveness in this country. I'm grateful to my community and my country. I want to give back. So why not? Why not run? I stepped up. Turned out I was one of many, and one of many people who stepped up in different ways. For me, it was throwing my head in the ring and running for office. For other people, it was volunteering for the first time. It was voting for the first time. And here we are.
Was there a moment where you made the decision? Was there like a last straw for you where you said, that's it, I'm going to run?
So that's actually a funny story. I was at the Kennedy School at the time. I was studying my master's in public policy, and there was a panel of young elected officials. There was a young mayor, a young state representative, and I looked at them and I'd been thinking, what can I do? What can I do to give back politically? And I think seeing that example was what helped me decide, well, this is what I want to do. Why not? And that's why I think having an example, it's kind of, it all feeds into each other. If we have more communities vote, then different communities and diverse folks will win as well, which will then inspire other generations to get engaged. And so I'm so committed to being out there, to helping inspire new generations, different people to get involved in our political process. It really starts with every one of us.
Professor Cortina, what do we know about the numbers of Latino voters? We often hear that this demographic votes less often than other demographics, is less politically engaged. What do the statistics show us? Is that true?
Well, it is true. Unfortunately, Latinos are the group or the demographic group that votes at the lowest rates in comparison with other demographics in the country, in the state, in the city, everywhere. And and perhaps, many of the reasons why is, well, first of all, this issue of political socialization in terms of how to understand the system, how to participate on the one hand. The other issue is lack of enthusiasm in particular races. However, 2010, we saw a completely different thing, at least here in Texas, a complete different turnout in terms of the composition of the electorate and the reasons of why they were participating in the election. Another important point that I think is very important to highlight is that it needs to be a connection between my vote and the policy outcome that vote is going to have. If I vote for a particular candidate, but later I don't see that my needs, wants, preferences, whatever it is, are not materialized in a public policy, then I become a little bit disenchanted, maybe turn off and say, why am I voting if my vote doesn't have a real impact? I understand that the probability that my vote is going to have a significant impact on an election is 0. However, it's very important, that connection. And the other part that I was mentioning in time for that is that political parties need to start paying attention. Both political parties need to start paying attention to Latino voters. And here you enter into a catch-22 situation. The first one is, if you're a political party, right, and let's say that you invest $1 on, getting the vote efforts, you want to see that dollar that is going to be a return on a vote, right? Just a very simplistic way of seeing things. So where are you going to put that dollar? Well, you're going to put that dollar in a demographic that, is going to give you at least, 80% chance that is going to vote. For Latinos, it's around 20%, right? So you're going to say, well, I'm going to put $1, and then the probability that this person is going to go out and vote is going to be only 20%, then no. And the last thing that I would say is that this needs to change because the numbers are there, right? If you look, for example, in terms of Texas, if you compare 2002 to 2019, you have around 220,000 more Latino voters that are registered. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people that can change one election one way or the other. And the last thing is that also we have to take into account the different types of electorates that I talked about. And there you have a potential pool of voters that can actually go out and vote, around 3.7 million people that are waiting to be supported by a political party.
Evelyn in our audience has a question about voting. Evelyn, while you make your way to the mic, Angie, I wanted to ask you, you talk with potential voters all the time. Are there one or two main reasons that they tend to give most often for why they don't vote?
A lot of it is lack of information. They don't know when the election is coming up. They don't know the fact that we have an election more than every 4 years. They don't know where to go vote. There was a lot of confusing information on, well, during early voting, I can vote anywhere, but on election day, I have to vote in my assigned location, and where do I find that out? And nobody sent me a card, nobody contacted me, you're the first person that's come by. So those conversations that we have on the field are just super important because you get to understand, one, you get to hear people's story, so the issues they care about. So the ask is not, I need you to go out and vote, but it's, tell me about your life, tell me about the issues that are impacting you, and let me connect you with the proper information, so then you can actually make sure your issues are being heard and are being addressed through an election, and then keeping your elected officials accountable. But it's lack of information, and it's also, I've never voted before, so why should I start now? So it's that initial step that people need to take of, well, I haven't voted before, I haven't voted in a really long time. Why is this election important? Who are we voting for? It's just a really large gap in the knowledge that people have in the Latino community. So that's why Mi Familia Vota really seeks to engage our community so we can, one, talk to them in their own language, and two, really meet them where they're at.
Jacob, same question. What is it that you think prevents Latinos from voting as often as other demographics?
Well, I think it's a lack of role models, and this is why I think the election of Lina Hidalgo was so important, because she's a role model for conservative Latinos, liberal Latinos, because there had never been a Latino who had achieved this result. Latinos had run for this position before, or had talked about running, but never had one been successful. So I think when you see a role model like Lina, that inspires people that they can make a difference, that they should vote, and I think we need more role models. And I think the media has made a big deal about AOC in New York, but Lina represents many more people than AOC, and it's right here in Houston. So I'm proud to be on the panel with you, Lina.
Yeah,
and thank you for running and for winning.
About 4.3 million in the county, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, wait and see for the next census, so it'll probably be well above that. And it's the title's county judge, but it's not a judicial position. It's an executive position that helps control the budget for our county. That's this fiscal year's budget is over $5 billion. And of course, our county's at the last census 43% Hispanic. But we had never had a woman, had never had a Hispanic person serve in that position or elected to that position. But thank you, Jacob.
Should we get to some audience comments? Evelyn is at the mic. Hi, Evelyn. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. What's on your mind?
So I'm actually Maria. I'm here to read the question for her.
Oh, okay.
And the question is, I get that I need to vote, but I don't feel that it's important. Should I vote for people who can't vote?
Should I vote for people who can't vote?
Yes.
Angie?
Can I take that? So Mi Familia Vota has a youth leadership program, and the large majority in this youth leadership program is largely composed of high school students and some college students. 90% of the students that we work with cannot vote, either because they are age ineligible or citizenship status ineligible. But they are some of the strongest civic leaders I know here in Houston. And so they are the ones that are engaging their family members, engaging their peers. They are the ones that are asking and demanding that their school administration host a voter registration drive for their seniors, because they know that even though they cannot vote yet, that they play an extremely powerful role in making sure that the Latino vote is being heard, that we are getting our community out to vote, and not just the Latino community, but we, across all cultural communities here in Houston. So yes, I would say find out, have a conversation with the people that you love, what is impacting them, what issues matter to them, and see if there's an upcoming election that is gonna intersect with those issues. And if there's candidates out there that are really going to advocate for your loved ones, and consider voting and consider getting that proper information and speaking to those candidates and making sure that you can vote on behalf of those who can't.
Judge Hidalgo, you've also been working on issues of voter access, particularly with regards to a voter roll purge in Texas that took place, the Harris County pushed back against. Tell us how you dealt with that.
Yes, so that's where you have to remember Harris County is the largest county in Texas. third largest in the country. We're larger than 26 states. And so my take is, if the county and the county commissioner's court has direct decision-making authority over an issue, we ought to decide the right way. If not, we ought to advocate. On the voter roll purge, we got a list, our county got a list from the state with almost 30,000 names of people that they said were perhaps not actually supposed to be voting. And at the time, that came to our tax assessor collector voter registrar. Of course, that's a vestige of the poll tax, the fact that that's the same elected office, and Bennett. And we worked together, and her office basically took an initial look at this list of 30,000 people, and immediately they saw, if you took out the duplicates, and there was a mistake because it was clear that the list included people who had simply gotten their driver's license when they were permanent residents and then become U.S. citizens. So, okay, you identify all those people, take those out. Then you're left with 11,000 people. All the other folks, just upon an initial cursory look, are folks who are dutifully registered and able to vote. And so we immediately stood up and said, and used our voice as the largest county to say, this list is suspect. We should not be claiming that these folks are not eligible to vote. And what the state was requesting was that our tax assessor collectors send a letter to these voters that basically asked them to prove their citizenship within 30 days. Of course, the problem is, hey, what if you don't get the letter? What if you don't have a passport handy? And then suddenly you're disenfranchised. So we pushed back. We weren't the only ones. Different organizations across the country, legal organizations, sued. That's currently being litigated in the courts. But you did have counties like, the county home to Waco here, and they went through 100% of their list, found that not a single person was actually ineligible to vote. So it's unfortunate that we have to be vigilant against these claims, but we have to look out for our voters. Just as we try and push to expand voting, we have to protect against folks trying to curtail the right to vote.
Sarah is in the audience, and she wanted to ask about her representation. Sarah, while you make your way to the mic, Jacob, Monty, let me ask you what you find some of the biggest issues are for you and other members of the Hispanic Republicans of Texas. Are they dramatically different from what Hispanic Democrats in Texas are thinking about? Are they more similar? What do you see?
Well, the Republican Party is grappling with how to do better with Hispanics. And if we don't start doing better with Hispanics, we're going to be a minority party. We know this is what happened in California. And it seems simple to me. The rhetoric on immigration has to change. Not everyone, has gotten that message. Certainly, the rhetoric from the president has not been helpful. So, we're as a party, we're struggling with how to do better with Hispanics when we have the president and others that have used bad rhetoric toward Latinos and immigrants. So. It's a big issue. We can't get more of the Anglo vote. That much is clear. I mean, you can't win elections with 120% of the Anglo vote. And for me, as a Bush Republican, I look back when we were getting 45% of the Latino vote in 2004. It's possible, but again, the rhetoric was different. So we're doing some soul searching. Hopefully, we can turn it around because I'm a proud Republican. I believe in limited government. But I'm pro-immigrant, so some soul searching.
Josh, and if I can just respond
Sure,
to that, I think one thing that we saw between 2014 and 2018, these midterm elections here in Harris County, almost a doubling of the Latino vote. And that to me does remind me of California, in mid-90s, Prop 187, and it was attacking immigrants' right to access healthcare and basic necessities. And I think in a way, we're seeing that nationally, if not at least here in Harris County, where the rhetoric and the attacks are galvanizing the community to participate more than they had before, and to see what somebody brought up earlier, this connection between a vote and the policy.
Sarah is at the mic. Hi, Sarah. What's on your mind?
Hello. So as a person in DACA, I'm incredibly concerned with my right for representation, and I was very disappointed when the bill passed in Congress did not mention anything about people under DACA, and that it is the bill passed to end the government shutdown. So my question is, what is being done at the local, state, and even community level to guarantee representation and equality for people with DACA and people who just couldn't get DACA?
Who wants to take that one? Professor?
Well, I think, we have to see it as with a big caveat. So, on the one hand, if nothing changes for the 2020 census, every single person that lives currently in the United States without any concern about citizenship status will be counted, right? That triggers a reapportionment process at Congress, and that distributes the number of seats that each state will have in the next Congress. So that's one part of indirect representation. So as the number of certain groups are growing, right, that representation in theory will be reflected in Congress. You have more people, therefore you will have more people that are going to be involved in politics, so on and so forth. In terms of DACA, I think that unfortunately became a scapegoat for a political process. So that political process is going to be, to a certain extent, divided between the Republican and the Democratic Party. And those representatives that believe in DACA, right, that believe in terms of, they're not at fault, are members, contributing members to our society, they're producing, they're working, so on and so forth, then we'll see a different opinion. And the very important thing is that public opinion in terms of DACA, which is overwhelmingly favoring DACA and the path to legalization, it's completely different than what we see in Congress, right? That opposition. So there is a very important disconnect between public opinion, what the public wants, and that representative democracy that in theory our representative elected should be representing us in our views in terms of DACA precisely.
Professor, if I could follow on that, you mentioned the 2020 census. Do you see that having any kind of impact on turnout for Latino voters as an issue?
Well, I think it's I think it could go both ways, right? I think that we saw in the midterm election, we saw that Latinos, a vast majority of Latinos, I think around 70% said that they voted because they felt that it was their duty, but also because of the rhetoric surrounding the 2018 midterm election. But then on the other hand, Latino voters may be intimidated, right? They might be intimidated by, deportation or whatnot. Should I carry my naturalization documentation with me all the time? If not, can I be deported, or what's going to happen? So I think it can go both ways, and it's going to depend, I think, on different communities and how that population is distributed.
Benjamin had a comment that he wanted to share. Benjamin, while you make your way to the mic, I wonder, Angie, what you are doing, what you're seeing done as well, to make sure that more Latinos get to the polls, especially with some of the concerns that the professor just raised. What do you find works best in terms of driving turnout? Or has that been figured out?
I think a lot of it is reaching people where they're at in the language they speak, but it is really on the on-the-ground conversations that we have with people that we really start to realize, how can we reach them? For some populations, it is, at their house, in their own communities, in the places that they trust, in the schools, with the other community groups they trust. For our young people, it's on social media, right? So we have to rethink our outreach efforts based on who we're trying to outreach to and what language and what spaces, what is attracting them. And I think a lot of it is, another really important part of it is, how do we include them in the work that we're doing? They don't want to just be asked, I need you to go vote. They want something more. One of the most exciting things that came out of the 2018 elections for me is that when we're done with our heavy GOTV outreach and, everybody kind of just wants to drop dead and, on November 7th, some of our students were asking, what comes next? What do we do next, right? Because the work never stops for us. So we also need to realize that how do we include young people in our community and that continuous year-long civic engagement? How do we include them in our census strategy, in our census outreach? How are we including them in the Texas legislative session? So really rethinking how are we not only how are we building up our voting block, but what are we doing beyond voting?
Go ahead, Judge.
Well, it's just that I think all of that outreach, the language access, it sets a tone, right, for the community, and we do have a very real issue. You know, when after Senate Bill 4 passed, for example, the state legislature, which meant that that folks can be stopped in a traffic stop, or they could be asked about their immigration status. Rates of reporting for rape and domestic violence went down among women. We have those issues now. We need folks to reach out and participate when it comes to Harvey recovery, when it comes to healthcare access, but they're afraid. And so in that sense, it's setting the tone. We're very concerned about the census. The county has filed an amicus brief supporting the different jurisdictions that are saying there can't be a citizenship question on there because it'll depress turnout, and ultimately that'll keep dollars from flowing to our communities. But I do think, you know, even if we don't have a direct role in something like DACA, for example, our ability to stand up for the communities, to speak to them in their language, which is something that I've been very focused on, making sure we have language access, making sure I always say things in both English and Spanish, just trying to reach communities where they're at, and we're just beginning, but I think that goes a long way.
Before we get to Benjamin, Jacob, could you answer the turnout question also? Do you find turnout challenges among Hispanic Republicans in Texas?
Yeah, yes, I think it can be depressed as well. You know, one of my frustrations about all of this discussion about voter ID and alleged fraud is sometimes it becomes an excuse for Republicans doing poorly at the polls. So there's this narrative that, oh, you know, there must have been some monkey business going on because we wouldn't have gotten clobbered that bad. And we saw some of that after the president was elected, where he talked about 3 million, you know, illegal voters that were never found. But I think voting has to be something sacred, and you have to preserve the integrity. But you shouldn't allow it to justify why a particular group did poorly at the polls, and then it becomes just a sham.
All right, Benjamin, you are at the mic. Benjamin, what's on your mind?
Thanks. I was never involved in politics. In fact, I actively avoided getting involved in politics. That is until 2016, when I saw that the national dialogue was about my community without my voice. And what I mean by that, being a Latino immigrant, once undocumented public health professional. When I saw that happen, I just decided to quit my job, a C-level job, 6-figure salary, to run for office. And although I didn't win this time, it led to me starting a program with the Houston Community College System to train young people to run for office. And so I was really excited to see Judge Hidalgo win, because that's what we need to see more of. So here's a question. What can we do to train the next generation of leaders? How can we be intentional about engaging young Latinos, not only to vote, but to run for office themselves? Because I think we need more of that as well.
Benjamin, before I let the panel answer, and Angie, I think you want to jump in, and Professor, you might want to jump in too. Can I just ask Benjamin what you've been doing, like what your organization does to try to foster that kind of engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's taking, I'll give you my example. I was a political science major at Rice, by some standards a pretty good school, but I didn't learn when I wanted to run for office. I had to be like, okay, how do you do this, right? So the idea is teaching young people and saying, hey, as you go through your formal education process, here's also another path. You can run for office yourself. Here's how you do it. Here's how you file. Here's how you speak to the media. Here's how you run in a board meeting, conduct yourself, because these are all the skill sets that you'll need if you get elected, because that skill set isn't there, even in our formal systems of education. And what we saw with this program at the Houston Community College System, to our knowledge and the best that we could find, it's the first in its country that is done in partnership with a formal institution of education.
Angie, and then Professor?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you said, how do we train the next generation of leaders, and not how do we train the next voter, right? And so I think our current strategy is very much focused on when somebody turns 18, we want to register them to vote, we want them to vote. We get disappointed when they don't go out to vote, right? And then we get upset that, oh, young Latinos aren't voting, clearly they just don't care. But it's really taking a holistic strategy and how do we engage them in a way that, one, it matters to them, that we're teaching them skills where they can apply them across a lot of different fields. And we're talking to them about issues and spaces where they need to be because there's decisions being made on their behalf where they're really just not part of that process. But thinking about it, we want voters, but we want advocates, and we want public servants, and we want researchers and people that understand elections and people that know how to run campaigns. So we really want to make sure that as we're empowering this next generation, that we find a role for everyone, that everyone deserves a seat at the table and everybody has something to contribute. And as we're thinking about developing these new leaders, is asking them, where do you see yourself playing a civic role?
Actually, Professor, if you would mind, I'd like Jacob to answer that question as well, and then I'll come to you, Professor. Jacob?
Gosh, the question was, Benjamin, I know it was a good one.
It was a very good one. In terms of how to engage the next generation of political leaders, including kind of training them in how running for office works and how being elected works.
Well, I think, Benjamin said it, we need role models, though, and I think that's why it's so important when someone like Lina wins, and because for a lot of Latinos, we haven't seen someone that looks like us win or even run. So I think role models are important. I think, to someone like George P. Bush, who's a role model for Latinos as well. In order for us to get active politically, we have to see people that look like us that have done it, and that I think that'll inspire other people. I think the program that Benjamin is leading is a good start as well.
I'd also like to talk about some of the issues that you find are going to come up to the surface in 2019 and 2020. Franklin also wanted to share his story, so while Franklin makes his way to the mic, Professor Cortina, how would you answer Benjamin's question?
Well, I think, first of all, at the University of Houston, we have that class. So I'm sorry that Bryce doesn't have it, but we have a political campaign class at the University of Houston. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we live in a democracy that is a political party democracy. So political parties are not doing their homework. They're not recruiting. They're not going into the communities and starting to form leaders. We saw in the 2018 election, if political parties recruit the right candidates, not the right candidate on paper, but the right candidate for the district or for the county, wins. We saw Judge Hidalgo, great candidate in terms of preparation, in terms of studies, education, so on and so forth, but also the right candidate for the county. So that's one issue. The other issue is that if young voters do not understand that their vote has a significant implication in their daily lives, right? The government is present in our lives every single day. So anything that, or the person that is going to be elected is going to have a role in our lives, whether we like it or not. So it's very important to present the issues as if this group of people, let's say Generation Xers, my generation, vote. Frankly, I don't care right now about college tuition, right? My kids are not there yet, right? I'm not worried about that stuff. Young voters are. So my block, right, we're starting to think about Social Security. Am I going to be able to retire or not? We're starting to think about other issues that perhaps certain candidates are not going to represent. So if my group of people, my generation, go out and vote at higher numbers, right, my issues are going to be represented. And the question to young voters is, are your issues going to be represented or not? And it's your responsibility, right, to go out and vote. If not, you don't have, really a say on this situation. That's how democracy and that's how elections are won, by the number of people who go out and vote. Whoever has more people wins.
But I think to that too is it's up to them to show up and vote. I think it's also up to us in government to lower those barriers. So you talk about young people voting, and we talk about high schoolers, for example.
Right.
Texas law says that schools are supposed to encourage voting among kids when they turn 18. And there have been, I think it was the Texas Civil Rights Project put something out recently, only about 30% of the schools have requested the documentation they would need to go register those students twice a year. So, we're working with our tax assessor collector to make sure we get into those schools. You mentioned voting centers earlier. It's confusing to people of all ages. In our community in Texas, you vote, you've got one early voting location, then you can vote anywhere in those polling locations that are open. Come election day, and I've seen this happen, somebody shows up after work, they drive to their polling location that's assigned to them based on where they live, they get there, they can't make it before the polls close at 7, or they get to the polling location close to their work, and it's 6:30, and they're told, sorry, you're not assigned to this one, you gotta go drive 40 minutes, there's no way they're gonna make it by 7. And so part of what we're doing, our county clerk, and we've approved and right now, actually, this will start in the May election, which different cities within the county are having school board and city elections, is for people to be able to vote at any polling location on election day. You would think that was already happening. I mean, it's just incredible how much catch-up we do. We got to start, and it takes both sides. It takes the community getting engaged and fired up, and the parties doing that, but it also takes us lowering those barriers to entry.
One of the things that gets communities fired up are the issues that they're voting on. So we'll focus on that for the time that we have left. But first, Franklin has a comment. Then I'd love to hear from Maria and Cortina. So if you two could make your way up to the mic as well. But Franklin, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Hello, panelists, audience, and listeners to the 1A show. My name is Franklin. I'm 24. I'm a senior in the University of Houston. I, among the 700,000 plus dreamers, grew up undocumented in this country and was privileged enough to acquire the Defer for Childhood Arrivals, also known as DACA, here in this country. I want to make this short testimony as to why the Latino vote matters and why, immigrants in this community also matters. But I want to start by just giving a quick a background of my story. You see, my parents, back in the 80s, they grew up in the Salvadorian Civil War. They're from El Salvador. And, understanding that kind of childhood after the war, my dad in particular decided to move into a safer environment that he could provide for his family, and he came over to the US. After a couple of years, my mom and I were brought over. And during that time growing up, in a Latino household, there wasn't really much awareness as far as like communication between the community, between public officials, between the issues going on. And it wasn't until recently, about a couple of years ago, when you're sitting listening to the radio or watching television, and unlike any other experience, when you're hearing people talk about a particular issue, in this instance, the issue was me. People were talking about me. And I know for some people who become civically engaged and someone who cannot vote in this country, I knew I had to do something. And one of the things that I've realized as far as living here in Houston and in this community is that a lot of young people, and even immigrant communities and Latino people in general, aren't knowledgeable or informed about the issues in their communities, or don't know that understand the resources available to them, or the processes on how accessing resources, voting, elections, and registering to vote. And it was kind of an eye-opener to me because there are these communities that exist, but almost seem like they are forgotten. My work as far as being DACA recipient, and although I cannot vote, I try to encourage people to vote because I can't. And I do that because growing up in this community, I realized the importance of being stronger together and trying to communicate with your neighbors about the importance of facing tough issues in your community. And one last note as far as becoming civically engaged is essentially teaching people that people like me, immigrants, do care about their neighborhoods, do care about the country they live in, and do want to get involved. It's just a matter of fact of whether you should give them the opportunity or not to. And thank you.
Yeah, Franklin, thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your story. Before we get to Maria Angie, I'd love you to react to Franklin's story.
Yeah, I think the dreamers of all ages here in this country, or particularly here in Texas, are an interesting group because they may not have voting power. They cannot vote, right? That's a clear fact. But they have political power. Very, very strong political power here in Texas. I'll give you an example. At the Texas legislative session is currently happening right now. Almost every single legislative session, there is a bill that is introduced to roll back in-state tuition for undocumented students that attend a public institution in the state of Texas. It never gets very far because pretty quickly after it's introduced, community groups like Mi Familia, Vota across the state go to Austin and they advocate against it. Community members advocate against it. They're talking to their elected officials. Elected officials know that they will not be voted out by the undocumented population. They are voted out by the people that are loved by the undocumented population, by the dreamers, right? So, and it goes back to why do we vote? We vote for the people we love. We vote based on our values. What is important to us? What are the issues that are impacting our realities? Even if I am a U.S. citizen and I look around me and who I consider part of my community, I want to make sure their voice is heard. That to me is very empowering as an individual, but for our community. So Franklin, thank you so much for sharing your testimony. I think it's a really good example of how other dreamers in Texas definitely view themselves. And I also want to make one additional comment. Talking about lowering barriers, when we pass laws that instill fear in our immigrant communities and our dreamers, then they don't want to stand up like Franklin and share their story and share their testimony and share why it's so important that we vote on their behalf. So we have to make sure that as a city and as a state, we're really making sure that we're passing policies that are not stifling their voices.
Before we get to Maria and Karina, Jacob, I know you wanted to chime in.
Sure, and it goes to Franklin's comment, but also to Sarah's comment before that. I think the biggest enemies against immigrants have been in the Republican Party. But yes, there are immigrants in the Democratic Party as well, because there was an opportunity to get DACA solved. And I do think that there was almost an issue of let's save immigration and DACA for the 2020 election. I think the DACA community needs to hold both parties accountable, especially now that the Democrats control the House. And immigration it's too important to be political, and at least the DACA issue should be continued. Both parties need to be held accountable for it.
Is Maria at the mic? I think while we're waiting. Oh, Maria, there you are. Hi, Maria. Welcome back, Maria.
Hi.
Hi. What's on your mind?
Thank you. I'm a high school senior, and this is the first time I attend something like this. And I'm actually kind of happy that there's this sort of event like this here in the East End. And up until a year ago, I started getting involved in activism and politics. And it all started after the shooting in Florida. And we had the March for Our Lives rally here in City Hall. And that was the first time where I actually felt that I needed to do something. So I left the classroom and I went with my friend. We took the metro and we were there at City Hall. And being there, I felt that I was doing something important. And ever since that day, something changed. And my passion for activism has grown even more, especially with Angie and Mi Familia Vota. And also, the right to vote is very important. My father, as a little girl, he's always installed in me that to vote every single election. My father came to this country in the early 90s. And ever since he became naturalized and became a citizen, he is very proud that he gets to vote. And I'm just happy that I'm going to be able to do that when I turn 18. And honestly, I'm just very happy that there's an event like this in the East End, because I usually have to have my father drive me halfway across the town, and now it's here in my neighborhood. So thank you.
I'm glad we could make it easy for you to get here, Maria, because I'm glad that you speak up. Could I ask you? Yeah, I appreciate you speaking up. Could I ask you, Maria, before we keep moving in, Karina, we'll get to you next. You said that the shooting at Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, kind of moved you to get involved with the March for Our Lives and so on. So clearly, gun violence is one of the big issues that kind of fired you up to get you active. What are some of the other issues that are high up on your list when you are, an active voter, when you are, increasingly politically active? What else is high on your list?
I would say gentrification is one of the big ones. It's definitely happening a lot here in this neighborhood. A lot of the houses, neighborhoods that I knew growing up, they're no longer there. And it's very sad to see that. And a lot of our people here in the neighborhood have to move out elsewhere because they can no longer afford to live here anymore. My sister had to leave 40 minutes away and has to travel so much in the mornings and the afternoons because she couldn't afford to live here anymore.
Judge Hidalgo, I wonder if you could respond to that. We almost did this panel on gentrification, so I'm glad you brought that up because it's such a big issue. One of the things that came out in the reporting after Hurricane Harvey was about the way that the Houston area has been developed and kind of made so much more concrete that it made it hard for the stormwaters to recede, and so development's been a big issue, at least nationally, in terms of why Harvey went the way it went. Talk about how you deal with an issue like gentrification. Because on one hand, you've got communities who say, this is our home, this is not just our home, it's a cultural center that we want to keep. On the other hand, there's this economic imperative that you got to keep the economic engine of Harris County chugging. How do you balance that?
Yeah, and then how do you balance that with the reality that Harris County, Houston, we're built on a swamp, and so we have to be smart about the way we grow. So, it is unfortunate how much people are being pushed out to the suburbs in the sense that we don't have the transportation system to support that. So if you add housing and transportation costs in Harris County, and you make that your cost of living estimate, which, some folks do, then cost of living is just as high, if not higher, here than in San Francisco. And what we're focused on is we don't have a transit line from the airport, for example. We are building roads that encourage development sometimes where we shouldn't build. So we begin having those conversations, and we're working, for example, on including climate change estimates in our floodplain maps, making sure that as we plan for a more resilient community, that we're looking at flooding, that we're looking at housing. The county right now is doing a countywide housing study, first of its kind. So how can you come up with an answer to something as complicated as gentrification if we've never looked at housing as a whole? We are facing it around criminal justice system issues too. We're reforming our justice system. We are reforming the way bail is done in Harris County. And as folks are able to leave the jail who aren't supposed to be there in the first place, there's not enough housing for them. The same situation happens. Folks that want to move out of the floodplain because they discover, and now we're drawing this out and trying to proactively inform the community that they live in an area that some areas you can do projects. We're working on the projects to get them out of the floodplain. Other areas are just going to flood, so we offer to buy people out. If you buy people out, where else are they supposed to live? There's very real concerns. We're looking at them, and but they really just haven't been addressed in a very long time.
We got time for a few more comments. Let's get to Cortina on the mic. Hi, Cortina. What's on your mind?
Hello, everyone. Hello, panelists. My name is Cortina from the University of Houston. I got invited here with an invitation from the College Republicans. I would like to make some background before I go ahead and ask my question. I think one of the main issues in the Latino community is that we are misinformed and we don't do enough research on our own. My mom is really hard on, being pro-life, and before, she can't vote, but she would ask me to vote Democrat because that's what Latinos, for the most part, stand for when it comes to illegal immigration and other issues. But what she didn't know is that Democrats usually stand on the side for abortion, and especially with these bills in New York coming up, they're very broad and open for interpretation. Should the Hispanic community in Texas follow in Georgia's step in also having a bill where abortion is banned at 6 weeks? I think where most of Latinos are pro-life. We do see life as very sacred. So where should the Hispanic community stand on this issue, and how do we inform others about where we stand?
Cortina, that's a good question. I'd love Jacob and the professor to answer that, because Jacob, or before the program, I think you told one of our producers that based on core values, that more Latinos should end up being Republicans. But
yes, I agree that when it comes to distrust of government, family values, being against abortion, being in favor of free enterprise, I think Latinos would line up Republican, but for the toxic rhetoric on immigrants that repels Latinos away from the party. So, I agree, Cortina, that a lot of Latinos are called for different issues. Unfortunately, the the dog whistle on immigration tends to drown out other issues that could be attractors to the party, but a lot of times all we hear is the dog whistle, which is, we're not welcomed in the party and we're not wanted. So yeah, but I mean I agree that there are other attractions. Unfortunately, we don't hear about them.
Professor Cortina, what about issues like abortion in terms of the larger palette of issues that Latino voters tend to be most engaged on?
Well, it's why that illustrates why political parties perhaps don't know how to talk to Latinos, right? And I'll give an example. They may be, conservative on certain social issues, right? Like abortion, for instance, but Latinos tend to be more liberal, for example, on issues about education, on issues about health policy, on issues about the economy, so on and so forth. So when it comes to that, it becomes perhaps, bread and butter issues, right? Yes, social issues may be extremely important, but when it comes, well, can I send my kid to college or not? Well, these guys tell me that I can, but the other party's telling me, no, you can't. So how my vote is going to be decisive in that case. And the other part is that, political parties do not necessarily know, as a institution, know how to talk to Latino voters. You have the President Ford's, right, when he tried to eat a tamal, right, here in Texas when he was campaigning, he ate the tamal with the husk, right? And then on the other hand, right, you have...
Just for those who are listening who have never eaten a tamale, you're not supposed to. You have
right,
to, yeah.
Right. It's
Not
impossible,
good.
right?
For those of you playing the home game, don't do that.
Right, you cannot do it.
Your Mexican friends will laugh at you when you leave, and you'll never know why.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then you have President Bush, right, W. Bush, that knows how to talk to Latino voters, and that's why he got 40-something% of the Latino vote, right? So there are these issues about political parties that they have to think about it, but also in terms of how you divide social issues in terms of, real bread and butter issues.
Inga also had a comment. I know our time is running short. Inga, let's get you up to the mic, but Angie, I wanted to ask you in terms of issues, what do you hear from folks on the ground in terms of what they bring up when they say, here's what I want done, here's what I want changed, here's what I want action on? What's at the top of the list for the people you deal with?
I think it varies, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think people talk about the issues as they identify the community they belong to. So that's the Latino community. If they are really proud of being a young person, they're really proud of being a high schooler, of being a person that lives in the East End. Then they see what is impacting my community, and they really start to develop their narrative around that. So in the East End, it is gentrification, right? That's something that's close to their heart. If they come from a mixed status family, they're a dreamer, they're undocumented, it's immigration, because they see it play out every single day in their lives. So there are some issues that we care about, but what I notice is in the Latino community, we prioritize those issues that we have a personal connection with, that really every single day, we don't know that government is interacting with our lives, but it is, and it's immigration, it's education, right? That's something that we really value in our community. So we really want our students our children to go to college, and we want to make that accessible. It's healthcare, when your parent has to quit their job because they have a health condition, and now the child knows, I have the burden of, raising this family and have more family responsibilities because healthcare is an issue that is impacting my life. And as they start to think about those issues, then they're going to look to the candidates and the elected officials that are advocating on their behalf, right? So I think it's two-step. It's one, what are the issues that are impacting me personally? Who is going to advocate on my behalf?
Inga is at the mic. Hey, Inga, what's on your mind?
Good evening. Thank you, panel, and thank you, Joshua. As a native Texan, which I don't know that I can really say that when Texas was really part of Mexico, I'm curious to find out, given the climb of the national conversations, how is it that so many conservative Latino voters tend to vote Republican, given historically, what's going on?
Elaborate on what's going on.
Well, immigration is a classic example. It's really kind of weird that we would try to speak for a whole group of people in terms of what the issues are. We know that everyone wants bread and butter issues taken care of or addressed, and they want to feel safe with their votes. But the conservative arms, say Ted Cruz types, tend to forget their comeuppance, if you will, and seem to negate the real issues that are going on within these communities.
Jacob?
Well, Inga, I think at least the problem for me as a Republican is that Latinos are voting less and less Republican. Donald Trump won with 30% of the Latino vote. That's like the floor. He essentially got Mitt Romney numbers when a Republican like George W. Bush got 45 up. Some people say it's even more than 45%. But so Latinos are voting less and less Republican. That's what concerns me, and that's why I think unless the Republican Party can do better, Texas will turn blue, or it's already purple. So, that's what concerns me.
The conversations throughout the country are so vile and vitriolic. They're divisive at best, and it doesn't seem that when you have people that are in office, such as Senator Cruz and others like him, that seem to not get it. Even Marco Rubio. I lived a number of years in West Palm Beach, Florida, and as a native Texan who's moved back from one conservative state to another, I guess I'm a masochist, but I'm very concerned about it because these are not the issues that reflect our population.
Could I just tag on to Inga's comment, Jacob? I hear where you're going, Inga. I think you're being very charitable in your verbiage about it.
You gave me the rules.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Jacob, because in Donald Trump's campaign announcement speech, he said that Mexico is sending crime, drugs, rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. That was his opening salvo to the nation as to why he should be president. And he's engaged in a lot of very nativist, racist, nationalist rhetoric from the minute that he became a candidate, and hasn't really paused. How do you, as a Republican working here on the ground with a community that we all know the Republican Party needs, how do you work around that? There's so many Latinos, African Americans, LGBT people who will look at Donald Trump and say, as long as he's in your party, count me out. How do you work around that?
Well, look, that's the problem. And I was on his campaign for about 3 weeks, and he wasn't my first choice, but I thought, look, I want a Republican to win. I was able to overlook that opening speech that he made at Trump Tower, and I had 2 meetings with him. The meetings were great. He sat down and said, I want immigration reform. We're going to bring people out of the shadows. I was on board until he went to Phoenix and announced his immigration plan that called for deporting the Dreamers and mass deportations. That's when I resigned the next day and publicly denounced him. And so, look, it is a challenge. What I do as a Republican right now is I agree with him when he does something I agree with, which is mainly deals with the economy. When he does something bad on tariffs or on immigration, I don't sit quietly. And other Republicans are likewise disagreeing with him, not as much as I would like. But it is a tough situation because he's the leader of the party. And but I was happy to see some Republican senators buck him on the emergency declaration, and I was proud to see that because we shouldn't go along with him just because he's the president. If he's wrong, doesn't mean you're a bad Republican to disagree with the president. I mean, this is America. You can still do that.
Before we go, Alexander, you had a comment while you're making your way to the mic. Professor
Yes.
Cortina, did you want to jump in?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, demographics, to a certain extent, if the same rate of participation of the Latino vote and African Americans keeps increasing, right? The Republican Party, if it doesn't get its act together in terms of how to talk to these minority communities, is going to be in a very, 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 very dangerous position. If Democrats start winning Texas, right, in presidential elections, Republicans basically by getting 270 votes on the Electoral College, it's going to be extremely, very, very, very difficult for them to win the presidency in the near future. So that's one issue. And the question here is, in 2018, I think, at least in Texas, the electorate sent a message, right? The question is, and some representatives, Representative Strickland has said, well, we need to talk about these things because we're not talking as a political party, as Jacob is saying. And, you know, Cruz won with less than 2.7% of a margin, right? And in terms of a Latino vote, some say that it was 70-30 for Beto O'Rourke, and others say it was 80-20. So there is a message. The question is, are you listening?
All right, before we go, Alexander is at the mic. Alexander, what's on your mind?
Hello. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Joshua. My question is about how do you feel about the double standard of candidates of color having to prove that they are authentically in tune with their culture? And I bring this up especially because for a candidate like Julian Castro, who is currently the only Latino candidate, there have been questions or concerns raised about the fact that he doesn't speak fluent Spanish. And I have seen that, you know, during this period in time where there's rhetoric going around about how immigrants need to learn English in order to be considered truly American, what is this? How do you feel about this double standard being thrown around? And just as a quick note, like for a candidate like Beto O'Rourke, who is white, his ability to speak fluent Spanish is seen as a boon and a positive to him, and there's no question about him having to prove his commitment to a white community. And this isn't just related to Latino candidates in general, but also candidates of color in general.
Good question, Alexander. Judge Hidalgo, would you answer that, and then I'll come to the professor?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, and you know, it's not easy running for office, and I can say just as a first-time candidate, and I do think if you just look at a representation, clearly there's some barrier keeping diverse candidates from running and from winning. And part of the movement, I think, that started in 2018 with more people participating is this movement of encouraging folks to run and supporting that and nurturing that. And I think we need to continue doing that. I think that to the extent that it's about normalizing it as well, to the extent that we nurture new entrants, and these are diverse candidates that represent all kinds of communities, we will change the discourse and the culture around what we expect a candidate to look like or to do and not do. And I'll say for myself, you know, starting out, it was some groups that helped. You know, there's a Run for Something, a group that helps young candidates run for office. The Arena helps new candidates run for office. New training, staff support. We need to build that as part of our civic infrastructure just as much as we need to improve access to voting, just as much as we need to be inside the schools, just as much as we need to recognize that no community is defined by a single issue, but that it really comes with who each person is. So that's a wonderful question.
Professor?
Yes, we have to, I mean, we don't have to assume. We know that voters are sophisticated voters. Regardless of their race and ethnicity. Like, for example, if you don't go very far, you go to the 29th congressional district that was represented by Congressman Jim Green, non-Hispanic, white. He won, and he won every single re-election until he retired. Why? Because he was serving his constituency. He was actually serving his constituency in such a way that the constituency says, well, you perhaps do not represent me, descriptively speaking, right? But in substance, in terms of the issues that I care, you're doing a great job. And we also see it in, you know, we had this discussion the first time that President Obama ran. Latinos are not going to vote for a African-American candidate. And that was not true, because during his campaign, President Obama was able to communicate, right, the issues that substantively affect the Latino community, and therefore they voted. And the other way around, African Americans vote for Latino candidates, so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, the litmus test for candidates, and basically once they get elected, as Judge Hidalgo is saying, and this is, you know, very refreshing to hear from an elected official, is that we have to do our job in terms of representing the constituency and giving them what is important, and have this two-way street of communicating with the base, right? And say, what do you want? What do you need? What we can do? Let's sit down at the table and construct this more of a community policy-making decision rather than from the top down.
Thank you all for your great questions and stories. Before we wrap up, one last thing I'd like to do. And I'm going to kind of call an audible if I could. Could I get that wireless mic back that we had at the beginning? I'm going to ask the panel one last quick question, and then I have one question for everybody in the audience, whoever wants to answer it. I'd love for you to give me a little fill in the blank. If you absolutely want my vote, focus on blank, blank, and blank. In order. Your top 3 issues. After I'm done with the panel, I'll come down. Whoever wants to share their answer can. If you absolutely want my vote, focus on blank, blank, and blank, in that order. So give you a second to think that over while we give the panel their last chance to just state anything else briefly that you think that the nation, that political parties, that political action committees, that candidates should bear in mind about Latino voters. Let's start with the professor and work our way back to Judge Hidalgo, and then I'll make my way down to you. Professor?
Well, I think it's important to engage Latino voters. It's important to engage African Americans. It's important to engage Asian voters, non-white Hispanic. It's very important to engage all voters. We live in a representative democracy. And if we don't take that seriously in terms of our views have to be represented, then policies are not going to be as effective and as efficient as we would like to. In terms of Latino voters, I think that finally we can see, especially with younger generations becoming of age, right? We're going to have, at least in Texas, around 350,000 18 to 30 years olds entering the electorate by 2020. It's going to put a lot of pressure on how the American political system absorbs these votes and also how likely they're going to participate, because it's a two-way street, right? If Latino voters do not participate, then the whole issue and the whole kumbaya, et cetera, is going to deflate, and political parties are not going to start paying attention. So it's an interactive issue, and we're going to see a lot more.
Angie?
I think we need to rethink the strategies of engaging Latino voters and engaging young people. We get into this mindset that we can just do the same thing over and over again, that 60 days before an election, that we will just encourage people to register to vote and then to go out and vote and run a very traditional field campaign. And that's not working anymore. We're seeing that young voters are getting excited by different things, by different issues that we haven't heard in a really long time. And we have to make sure that their voices are being uplifted, that we're meeting them where they're at, and that we're investing in them. The candidates are wanting to go and meeting with these potential voters, not secured voters, potential voters, that community organizations are coordinating with one another to make sure that we're really covering the entire ground here in Houston and Harris County, and that the media is really highlighting and uplifting those young people, those candidates, those elected officials that have really stood their ground and said, we are going to engage and we're here for the long term. We're not just here through November.
Jacob?
Look, if you care about economic prosperity, you're going to vote to legalize the DACA community and their parents. America is not full. We need more workers, and the only way this prosperity continues is if we have more immigrants and we legalize the immigrants that are here. And in my book, they're Americans. Let's do the paperwork and make them official.
And Judge, while I make my way down?
It'll take work for every voter, stay informed, participating, whatever that means for you, for political parties, reaching out, showing up to the communities, doing, Spanish language outreach, TV, not just investing in the English-speaking community, but all the diverse communities. And for elected officials, it shouldn't be a mystery what government does, what any level of government does, and we need compassionate policies. We're going to repel communities if we don't have policies that extend a hand to them.
All right, let me work my way along the line. Everyone doesn't have to answer, but as I make my way across, just raise your hand if you'd like to. If you absolutely want my vote, focus on blank, blank, and blank. Young lady, are you old enough to vote yet?
Yes, I am. I'm 22.
Oh, I beg your pardon. You look so youthful. What are your 3 answers? Focus on?
So for me, continue the Hispanic record low unemployment, which will mean to focus on innovation and technology. We know most Latinos are frontline employees, and we know in my industry, technology will take over 30%, leaving a lot of people without jobs. So technology and preserving liberty in the United States.
Excellent. Anybody else? Very briefly. Benjamin, right? What are your 3?
Come talk to me, don't talk about me. Comprehensive immigration reform and criminal justice reform.
Stand up if you wouldn't mind. My arms aren't quite that long. What's your name?
Maya.
And what are your three, Maya?
So you have to focus on your character, my cultural nuances, and my economic power in the fourth industrial revolution.
Yes, what's your name?
My name is Michelle. I would like us to focus on the importance of net neutrality. I feel like we live in a very connected world and we're not paying attention to what's happening in public policies in terms of the internet. I think we need to focus on women's reproductive freedoms. I believe that we should be in charge of our own bodies and that we have the right to be treated as whole human beings, and also the importance of science, especially when it comes to climate change. I have gone through about 5 natural disasters in the last 8 years, and it just cannot keep happening. It's not sustainable for our society.
Who else? Yes, what's your name?
Patricia Limón de Rodriguez. So for me, it would be different depending on what they're running for. So if they're running for an executive position, executive candidate, executive branch, that you represent a diverse, what they need to focus on, that you represent a diverse group of people and that you are not a dictator. For legislative candidates, ensuring my rights are protected. And for a judicial candidate, knowing the law and ruling fairly.
Excellent. Anybody else? Who else? Alexander, is that it? Alexander, what are your three?
Reducing corruption, meeting your constituents, and increasing refugee admissions.
Who else? Yes, sir. Stand up if you would. What's your name?
I'm Brian Lopez.
Come a little closer, Brian. I'm leaning real far. What's on your list, Brian?
All right. Nonpartisan policies based on data, financial and political education for the community, and make sure you have transparent financing for your campaigns.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. Who else? I'll make my way up to you in just one second. Anyone? Yes? What's your name?
My name is Jessica Bolaños. My three are women, business, and immigration.
Excellent. Yes. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Nelson Venegas. Mine are comprehensive immigration reform, education, and environmental issues.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
Shirley Ronquillo, access to health care, affordable education for everyone, and affordable housing for communities like mine where the average income is $47,000 a year.
I hear that. I hear that. Yes, ma'am.
Sonia Rivera, candidates need to recognize that Latinos is not a one-size-fits-all community. There's Puerto Rican Hispanics, there's Cuban Hispanics, Mexican Hispanics, Honduran, and so on and so on and so on. So there's no one solution that fits every single individual in the Latino community. So when we speak to the Hispanic community, we need to recognize that there are differences in our communities. While we still share the Hispanic experiences, we are different in many ways. I believe in compassionate policies, but I would like to add the word responsible. Compassionate but responsible policies.
Thank you. Over here? Let me work my way upstairs. Hold on. I'm getting there. I'm coming. Up the ramp. Who? Over here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Javier Perez. I'm the director here at Talento Bilingüe. And one of the things I'd love to see is for these both parties to really embrace the Latino community. And you show me a party that has those brown faces in them. You know, I really want to just show so much respect for Mr. Jacob Monty, because Jacob, when it came down to it, you stood up and you held yourself responsible and liable, and you crossed that line, and I appreciate what you did. And even though I'm a Democrat, I appreciate what you did. And I long for those days of the Bush Republicans voting again. But so I want to see them embrace the Latino community. I would love to see them, of course, have a immigration reform and also pass the citizenship.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
My name is Paul Fletes. I'm a third-year teacher, high school teacher, and so my number one focus, vote thing, is education and just focusing on public education funding. Number two, gerrymandering. If you look at CD number 2, crazy, just don't do it. And number 3, overturning Citizens United. # get big money out. Yes.
Anybody I missed? Well, in that case, thank you all for your answers, and thanks also to Lina Hidalgo, Harris County Judge. Judge Hidalgo, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Jerónimo Cortina, an associate professor of political science and the associate director at the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Houston. Professor Cortina, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Angelica Razo, the Houston area coordinator for Mi Familia, Vota. Angie, thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
And immigration attorney Jacob Monty, a member of the Political Action Committee, Hispanic Republicans of Texas. Jacob, thanks for being with us. Well, our show today was produced by Amanda Williams. Special thanks to Elizabeth Troval of Houston Public Media. Thanks also very much to the team here at Talento Bilingüe de Houston. The 1A team and some of the panelists will be sticking around in the lobby if you have any additional questions that you'd like to get answered. Our team will be back in Houston soon for another Across America event. We visited this year. We will be back next year before the 2020 election. Until then, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you for coming tonight. Good night.